Okay, I believe I'm unmuted, but I'm not 100% sure, so I'm not going to say anything important until I'm told I'm unmuted. Hopefully, everyone's ready to talk about math and or feelings. I'm good. Sounds like I'm good. All right, no volume adjustments needed. Let's go. I'm going to move this thing on my screen so I can't see my own face. Otherwise, I will lose track of what's actually going on. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Alex Sprague, and I'm going to talk about math and feelings today for the IGDN Summer Series. Hoping to illuminate some points on where these ideas intersect, and to help show why I might have some specific insight on this here. A few facts about me. I was actually once the richest player on Neopets, and I did it by cheating. I was banned later that day, and the real important thing, that really gave me a view from the top most people wouldn't understand. I understand what comes with the feeling of being on that peak. It actually has nothing to do with this, so let's talk about math. That was just, had to get those feelings out of the way and brag about my Neopets cheating. Some people are into math, some aren't. People tend to have a lot of different feelings about math, and most of them are pretty bad. That's why my goals in this talk are to make sure you know why people make the choices they do, know why people are afraid of crunch and tend to hate math, and provide some simple guidelines to make players feel better about math within games. And this is why I want to focus this talk on one specific type of math we use in games, the one that tricks people into actually enjoying math: statistics' evil brother, probability. Probability is what we're talking about whenever we think about a dice roll, coin flip, or drawing a card. That is the obvious and normal use case for probability. But it is also what I'd consider the most interesting field of mathematics from a psychological point of view. And when making up games, we're setting up fields for interesting choices to be made. And while at times we as game designers fret over the exact odds of an action happening, we sometimes miss the larger point. You cannot see the slides change. What do I do about that? I'm gonna figure this out. Fun time. Stream starts soon. Let's see. I think I probably have to do it right here. Yeah, I'm gonna capture the entire screen instead, and let's hope this works. Did that make a change? It looks like it did. Are we good? There we are. Okay. These are the goals again. These are what I'm trying to demonstrate. Going into probability. Here. What did I say last? I said when making games, we tend to fret over stuff. Is that what I was saying? Was I on that line, guys? All right. I think I was on that line. We tend to fret over the exact odds of actions happening, trying to make kind of a simulation type games. That tends to be what we shoot for. Not always, obviously, but that is kind of what I would consider the platonic ideal of what game designers are always doing, is trying to figure out what odds seem right, and then a lot of game designers go, actually, those odds don't feel right in the game, so I'm going to tweak them. And I think by getting bogged down on specific points of statistics and probability, we kind of miss some larger points. Because within game design, the single biggest thing we do is actually make choices possible. We aren't just doing the odds of a specific action. It's not a one-to-one simulation of life. No one's ever going to make that game. What we're doing is taking what things we want to talk about and making those possible, and then making the odds inform the play. So our structure of what we're making games for informs play more than odds of a single dice roll ever could. And while we use randomizers to build tension and decide things within games, the probability of what happens in the game is always defined by the game itself and not those dice or card flips or anything. Those are the secondary part of when we talk about probability. And the the psychology of probability also helps inform us on the kinds of choices that players are likely to make. As an example, I want to talk about the Monty Hall problem because I think what I said probably doesn't make any sense without context. The Monty Hall problem, is from the show Let's Make a Deal. The show was off the air, I think, 30 years before I was born, so if you haven't heard of it, no big whoop. I think game designers should know this specific game because it is interesting from a statistics point of view, but it's also extremely interesting on how people think about chance. And it's a simple game. People were it was super popular for a long time, and the idea of the Monty Hall problem became I guess meme would be a correct word for that, and it really encapsulates how people feel about chance. I'm going to go over what the Monty Hall problem is here. The way you win is one of these doors has a car, one has nothing behind it, and one has a goat. You are going to pick a door. We're taking the left one. I hope it is not. No, it wouldn't be. I was thinking it would be mirrored for you guys, but then all the words would be too. No slide change again? Huh. Wow. That is annoying. Let me move this. I already have capturing entire screen. Do it again. Maybe this did it? Alright. Now we're going to do a test. Did it change? Did the arrow disappear? There's a delay, so I have to be silent for a bit and just wait. Okay. We're good. Here's the picture of who I believe Monty Hall is. You might have missed that. I don't know if that's his real name. I'm going to call him that. We're back to the thing. I have so many things open on this screen now. It's great. Okay. One of the doors has nothing behind it. One has a goat. One has a car. We want to win the car, although a goat would also be good. I actually don't think you're allowed to take the goat home. So, we pick the door on the left. Next thing the host does every single time is he takes one of the doors out of the running. So we started with a 33% chance to get it right, and now, without understanding it, you might think we have a 50-50 chance. We know one of these doors is there. But that's actually not quite true. What happens is we're allowed to switch the doors, and we can take this middle one instead. This door now actually represents these two doors on the right side here. So we have a 66% chance to get the prize if we switch, because the host only ever takes out doors that have not won. So the door now represents all the doors we didn't choose, meaning we're twice as likely to win if we get that choice. As you can see, I added the probability here. So, should you switch? You should. That's where the smart money is. Your chances of winning are, again, 66%. That is double what you started with, so switching is always the best choice. Players are 2 times likely to win when they switch, and with knowing these odds and understanding the game, you'd think everyone would switch. And including players on the game, and then afterwards, we had time where no one wants to go. We have a lot of data on this. We know how many people switched, how many people didn't throughout it. And I would ask, as game designers and GMs and DMs, how many people do you think switch? When they know their odds are better when they switch. They did a study on this, and the answer is 33%. 33% don't switch. I'm flustered now. So, 1/3 of the population goes with their gut, knowing the odds are worse, even though, they know. And I mean, Bob the Man got it. It's less than half. But it's very interesting for me because this is money you're winning, right? I would always take the better odds when winning money. It is you just always take the best odds. I don't know what else you're supposed to do about it. I have 2 slides that say 33%. Don't know how that happened. But in cases like this, emotions trump logic. This is a big heightened emotional time, so more people probably end up not switching than you would if it was a less emotional time. If they just had, hey, do you want a 66 or 33% chance to win money? Which one would you take? They'd probably take the 66% chance more. But we know people gamble and they understand the odds, so it's just not true. For another example of how this happens in a less gambling scenario, I want to share a 2002 study on buying houses. In this, people were asked if they would buy their ideal house, whatever they like, whatever they're looking for in a house, and this was from a pool of people looking to buy houses. The only drawback is the area in which the house is located has a flood risk. One group was told their house was in a low flood risk, and one group was told their house was in a high flood risk. About 73% of people were willing to buy given the flood risk. The difference between the low and high flood probability is 1%, you can see there. Then they asked another group the same question, but before they asked, would you buy this house, they said, please list off all the bad things a flood could do to you and your home and your family before you make this choice. And they had them write it down. The house floats away, their things are destroyed, all the other things. And then they asked them. For the low flood probability area, they got 69%. And for the high flood probability, they got 54%. By reframing the question, making them focus on the motive part of the question, think about all your loss and all the bad things, they were able to make a low risk scenario go down by 3.3% and a high risk scenario go down by almost 20%. So the way we're framing questions shapes the outcomes of what people say, and that's something that's really important in game design. There was a bigger difference between the low and high risk thing, which was 1%. I'll go back to it. The difference between the original question is 1% when presented as low or high risk. When adding that emotional treatment, it was 15% difference. So you realize there's a bigger difference between the odds and the emotional treatment of it when you just say it's high or low. Nearly 20% of people change their choice due to emotional reasons instead of logical ones, and the phrasing of the choice mattered a lot. The framing of the consequences are important, not just the odds. And this is supported with this 2002 report from the American Psychological Association that summarizes my point. And I quote, risky situations, including decision-making, result in part from direct, i.e. not cortical, medicated emotional influences, including feelings such as worry, fear, dread, or anxiety. People are assumed to evaluate risky alternatives as a cognitive level as in traditional models, based largely on the probability and desire of associated consequences. I'm actually not going to read the rest. During that slide, you probably stopped caring as much about what I was saying because the way I delivered the information matters at times more than the information itself. What I was trying to frame here is not only is there emotional consequences to trying to understand things, there is mechanical ones. And that's what we're going to get into when talking about math in its entirety. Knowing your audience matters. That was an audience for psychological students, like grad students. No one here wants to listen to me read off 2 paragraphs of that, but I'll put the big points that they were making, which helps show what I was talking about with emotive consequences towards risk. The big points shown in the APA study are that most people are emotional beings, that they will risk more when the risk will take longer to cultivate into a negative outcome, and that how the risk is presented to them drastically affects the choices they will make. So, when you're making games, you can think people are not going to act logically every time. They are not going to make the same choice every time. They're going to let their emotions I guess, compromise or inform their choices. And if the risk of something bad happening is far away from you, they don't consider the risk as big. Even if it's the exact same percent, if it's not going to happen right now, push it off. It's fine. So I want to talk about framing choices and those ideas within game design. We're going to cover showing math and the rules around it in effective and negative ways. And I want to use an example that I saw first on social media, and it caught my eye because someone had said, quote, "I threw away this book when I read this paragraph." And this is another point of framing math and rules and odds. And I will read this one out. I think it benefits from you hearing it. First, subtract the tens die of your roll from the tens digit of your total chance. For example, if your total chance was 60% and you rolled a 41%, the difference would be 2. Next, add the relevant primary attribute bonus from which the skill is derived, equal to the tens digit of the primary attribute as well as any bonus advances. If the roll was a critical or sublime success, double this number before adding it. It's a bit of a mouthful, and I thought, as a game designer, am I critiquing in the way I critique my own writing, and is there a benefit to... Is it just something I'm used to and I do? And I decided to ask a group of people in a TTRPG Discord to read this and give me feedback on what they thought of this as an example of rules text. And they said, "This is very confusing and complicated. I'd wait for a real-time example / walkthrough of this process." And what I kind of think is the most damning is, as a copywriter, this feels confusing, but that might also be because I'm less skilled dice roll lingo follower. And these are people who have taken the time to be in a Discord channel about playing TTRPGs, or obviously into gaming. And because of how this is framed and told to people, they think they don't want to play this game. They think that they're not part of the in-group that this game is for. And this kind of communication of math turns someone who writes for a living, this person's a copywriter, and makes them feel like they're not the audience for the game. And this is how I think you get people who say, "I'm not a math person." And this is why I think this topic I'm talking about is important for game design. If someone doesn't feel like they belong when they're reading your game, then all the hard work making a perfect system with odds exactly right and where you wanted it was for nothing, and you've wasted your time. So, here's the thing though. I don't necessarily think you can't have a crunchy game. I think people want that. Every once in a while, I want it. I play Shadowrun sometimes. I won't run Shadowrun. That's way too much time out of my day, but I'll play it. And the big point I want to make here, though, is that the more complicated your math is in a game, the more clear and concise your writing can be. And I think, it can kind of be the inverse sometimes. There's games where you have almost no mathematical rules, and you can really get into the weeds of weird abstract stuff while writing it. But not just to kind of use this as a negative example, I think we have to use this as a chance to learn what parts of this are hurting it. And here are some of the things I think hurt this writing section. First is the multiple clauses within the sentences are increasing the complexity. Within the sentence, there's four commas within 4 sentences. So instead of just having a few more sentences, we have multiple clauses, really making it complex. And I think complex sentences don't mix with complex math. There's many technical terms that congest the writing, and while we as game designers might know most or all of these terms, it could definitely scare away new or even just less advanced players. And I say advanced in the term of have memorized way more gaming stuff than the average. The bolding in this draws your eye away from the rules and towards skill terms or just terms, and that makes it hard to parse what you're reading. I understand the bolding and using different ways to focus your attention in rules writing, but if it detracts from understanding the rule, it's not good. The paragraphs are too long. Whenever possible, we want to make rules text small, simple paragraphs. And we want to stay consistent with our style so we don't confuse any players. When we make rules, we should try to go for one idea per sentence. We shouldn't use any jargon or technical terms unless we have defined it beforehand. That's huge. Define every term you're going to use. I know what a critical role is. I do not know what a sublime success is, and you shouldn't assume others do. And finally, we need to remember that we're always going to be more comfortable with the rules we're defining than the players will be. So simplify whenever we can. And in order to show what this 2-paragraph thing is showing and how I would present it, here's this broken into steps. Roll under your total chance to succeed, subtract your roll from the total choice, then round that total. Lop off the 0 at the end as we don't need it anymore. You add any modifiers, and you double those modifiers if it was a critical or sublime success. This then corresponds to some kind of degrees of success table that I assume is in the book. Now, this isn't perfect. It's definitely not ready to be printed this way, but compared to the example on the left side, I could play this. It took me a long time to understand what was trying to be said on the left side, both because examples were mixed in it when they maybe should have been pulled to the left or right. And there was other examples on the page, but they were not on that page. So in the actual text, it was a little interesting, or a little interesting to find where you're at. But I think, as you see, by simplifying it down, it's just easier to read. And taking a moment to sum that up, I want to ask everyone to try to be cognizant of who they are making games for, because it's not other game developers. And while most of the people maybe testing out our games or talking about our games or, showing up to things like this are game developers, the massive majority of the people playing games are not game developers. Statistically, if you're watching this now or in the future, you have a better grasp on math than the majority of people who are going to play your games, because a lot of game developers tend to be higher educated. And remember, you probably started playing games when you're 8, 9? I think the first time I rolled dice at a table, I was 9. I definitely have a better understanding of math now than when I was 9. But past that, remember, you probably also watch more Mythbusters than the average. I'm just guessing because it's nerds watching this. You probably know what OSR stands for. Something that, I guess, unless you're into OSR, you don't know what that means. And we have all these other biases of being the nerds and type of people who would make games. And in order to successfully write math in a way that doesn't take people out of it and doesn't stop it and isn't a barrier to success, we have to remember, yes, nerds respectfully, I am here. Although I can't quote The Princess Bride that well. I know what wine in front of me means. That's about it. But, again, what I think is best to do is to not write math and rules and all this stuff based on the best examples we can get from game design, but we can take it from 2 other places. One is newspapers, which are written for mass consumption, and the other I took is from a guide on math writing by Francis Su. That was my 2 big things I boiled down into a few easy to steal tricks to make it easier for our readers. So we're going to go over a few simple tips here that I'm going to use to simplify writing for rules and math, make it easier to consume for gamers. You want to summarize what you're going to say up top. That makes it easier to skim back up and find what you're going to say, especially when it's rules heavy. This is how you attack. This is an opposed skill check. You died here. If they can see that at the top, They know where to go, and even if it is a little bit tougher to rule, being able to skim like that helps. And also, I didn't put it in here. Make your PDFs searchable because it's better than summarizing. Use short paragraphs. Each rule should have its own paragraph if possible, separated from other rules so you can look through and find it and reread it. No one should be, put out because they have trouble reading and paying attention to long, winding paragraphs. We should avoid jargon and shorthand, especially if we've not yet defined those terms. We should also simplify our writing as much as possible. That is very big in the math world, is to simplify as much as possible until you're at the basis and core of what you're trying to say. They can add the complications on later. You should refine what you're writing. Go back, reread it, do it again. You should refine what you're reading. I read out loud everything I write before it goes on the page. It helps. It makes it better. And finally, you should refine more because you should repeat important bits. Repeating the things you're saying before and after are going to get it stuck in their head, and they're going to care more about it, and they're going to know this is important, I'll remember it. Very few people remember something off their first time. And I found this quote from Francis Sue pretty important because while we're not writing math texts, that's something he writes. He's an award-winning math text person for ease of access. We have to think, taking these ideas and doing it towards making games, the number one thing I think we want from math within our games is to make it the smallest barrier to play we possibly can. It is more fun to quickly go from reading the rules to playing than the opposite. You don't... Character creation's fun, but I consider that play. But you don't want to go, oh, how do we do this again? Let's take a few minutes. We have to play. We're going to slow things down. And I want to be cognizant because we are in a kind of insular culture that goes off each other. There's times where some of these things aren't going to make sense, and you have to be cognizant of when they make sense and when they don't. If you're playing cyberpunk games and you want to refer to the gun you're holding as a blicky and you want to go into a lot of slang, that makes sense. You want to be surrounded by jargon. In cyberpunk, it makes you feel at home, makes it feel correct. Does that mean in cyberpunk your damage tables should have jargon inside of them? Probably not. Probably gonna make things confusing. And while it's a chaotic world and it's fun to be caught up in that chaos, you don't want to be caught up in the chaos of trying to write rules or read them. So, while we should spend our time writing what's important, while I'm talking about math and hopefully getting a feel for how players feel about it, whether it's, really just a barrier to play or if it's a motive experience and how statistics deal with that, I think we as game designers should worry about the math of what we do and why we're spending time on this math and learning how to use it. And I think, without fail, the crunchiest part of any game is combat. It's probably the hardest thing to write rules-wise. And for an example, because why would I not use D&D as an example, I've heard people say D&D is only about combat. And should we be putting forth so much effort on writing combat rules as D&D, or should we do less? Should we spend our time elsewhere? So I want to ask everyone, what part of the player's handbook, what percentage of spells in combat, and what percent of feats do you think are specifically about combat within Dungeons? This is all numbers specifically from the player's handbook, and I will let people actually guess while I drink coffee. And I'm a little in front of everyone, so take a sec. Alright. Again, specifically, percentage of the player's handbook about combat. Alright. Any other guess? Feels like 50, 60. For the player's handbook, pretty close. 49%, almost exactly 50. Now, spells as combat are... it's going to take too long because I'm like 15 seconds behind you, so I'm just going to go. It's 51.5 to 62.4% of spells are specifically combat-based. These numbers are different because I was able to find 2 sources for spells, where only 1 source for the first. It was a little interesting because someone said that they considered, Ice Storm as a 60% combat spell because it also made the floor slippery. So that is 40% an environmental spell. Whereas the second number comes from someone who said, obviously, combat... Yes, this is 5e, sorry. Whereas, obviously, that's a combat spell, so the higher number takes spells that specifically do damage and are used in combat as combat spells. So, the majority to the vast majority. And for feats, 74.5% of feats are specifically combat related. And while this is an interesting single point of data, it's not something I think we can make conclusions from. So I want to ask everyone, what portion of each Critical Role campaign do you think is combat? And this is taken with breaks and ads cut off and just the actual playtime. We were able to find this because people have documented every moment of Critical Role, and it was actually extremely easy to look up what percentage of time they actually spend in combat. And sure, guesses will come in. For the first campaign, it was 29%. For the second, it was 22%. For the third, it was 17%. And for the fourth, it was 26%. I saw a guess at about 40%. Actually dramatically lower. I would have never guessed this. I was surprised. I actually had Jess listen to a full episode while taking notes of when the combat happened, and their percentages were within I think 2 or 3% of these numbers. So I think they're fairly accurate. And I found this hugely surprising. I definitely thought actual plays spent way more time on combat, probably specifically Critical Role also. And when it turns out that less than a third of the time is spent on fighting, whereas some sections that aren't technically about combat with feats have 3/4 of it about combat, it shows a huge gap in where we're focusing our time. And while I can make the point that I only have the data from one game, albeit it's the most popular one, being, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, although maybe 1D&D is officially more popular today. And I only have data from one actual play. Also, it's the most popular one, but no one else has taken notes of every single campaign and dice roll they've ever done. Using this data, we can kind of see an interesting, in my mind, idea, which is, are we putting too much work into combat? Which is the crunchiest, most math-heavy section of every game, when people use it like half the amount of time that we're writing on it. And I think there's a few things that this could mean. One is that we spend too much time and space writing about combat in our games. That we are bad, maybe, at writing math-heavy sections, and therefore it is longer than it needs to be. That we don't spend enough time writing other sections instead, and we're just neglecting things because we're so focused on getting the rules of math and combat down. Or that we can't make a broad claim based on a single interaction of statistics, and that I'm presenting a flawed argument because I have an emotional and professional bias on this subject. Something we saw earlier with the flood thing. I probably am not the person to make a straight up objective choice on what this means, because we're using a system that I wouldn't necessarily agree on with a lot of its design influence. Anyway, for summaries. When playing a game, most of the choices have already been made by the designers. The designer has pre-selected when the player is going to be making rolls and dealing with odds, and that makes most of the games predetermined. I'm hoping I got that on camera. It's a little thin. And that's not a bad thing. You have to know what you're making. You're making a game where you go to space and mine minerals and do all this stuff. Of course, we're not going to have rules about how good you are at stir fry. Like, that would be a weird rule to throw in your space mining game. Now, cooking, fine, but you're not making a simulator, and that's why most parts of the game are only going in one section. Why we have so much combat in heroic games, and why we have so much intrigue in, God, I don't know, a Jane Austen game. A lot of intrigue there. Next, we should care about how we frame questions and decisions as much as we care about the odds behind the decisions. As I showed in the Monty Hall problem and the flood scenario, the actual risks involved matter less than what they get out of it. The prize of the car made a third of people take bad choices, and the flood scenario changed up to 20% of people from getting their ideal home. And we should care about making sure players understand the outcomes of a decision more so than the interior math of the decision. This matters more to players than the odds of a success or failure, so we should work on tweaking that instead of the exact math. And this hurts the soul of game designers, is to think, actually, people might not care exactly what happens with the math. They care about the outcomes and how the decisions work. And I know there's plenty of examples to the contrary where people are very, very upset about something not making perfect sense with odds. And that's going to happen no matter what we do, because you will never have a perfect simulation of a game. Next, we should think more about how we're writing and the effect it will have on players before they sit down to play. We're making games, we're not writing tax forms. Making clear, concise stuff helps. And if you're making crunchy games, make it more clear and concise. And read a guide on writing for math. It will help you. I have one in my sources by Francis Sue. Read that one. It is fantastic. It will make you better at writing rules because you'll understand how people write math. You have to know also who you're making games for so that you can indulge them. People want more lore. We can write less on combat, we can write less on math, and we could do more cool stuff that we want to write. Next, legally, I have to have a math equation on a talk called Math and Feelings. So, advantage is equal to 2/3 n plus 1/2 for any n-sided dice, making the average for advantage on a d20 about 14. You add 1/2 if the smallest number on the dice is 1, which it is for almost anything. If it were 0, there would be no addition. There you go. And finally, while I didn't talk about this, go learn to use anydice.com and Nandeck. Don't worry too much about doing all these things by hands. Throw it in a simulator and see how it works. If you ever want to put cards in your game, I cannot recommend Nandeck more. It is the single greatest thing in the world when it comes to quickly making games. Then you can print out stuff and just try it yourself. See how it feels compared to working on the math behind it. If it feels good, it doesn't really matter if it's mathematically perfectly sound, in my opinion. And anyway, here are all the sources I used. Check them out. They're pretty good. And I guess if there is any questiony things, I can shoot them out, but otherwise, I think I'm good to go here. And look at that. Look at that cool panel.